Lucia had always been the epitome of elegance and grace, with a smile that could light up a room and a heart full of warmth. From the outside, her life appeared flawless. She had the perfect marriage, the perfect house, the perfect life. Marcos, her husband of over 15 years, was the love of her life, the man she had promised to cherish and care for, in sickness and in health, as the vows had gone. He was her best friend, her confidant, her everything. Together, they had built a life that seemed unbreakable, one that would withstand any challenge life threw at them. But everything changed when Marcos was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. It started slowly, the tremors in his hand so subtle that they were easy to ignore at first. Lucia, at first, thought it was nothing, just a part of getting older. But as time went on, the signs grew undeniable. The tremors in his hands became worse, his gait unsteady, and his speech slurred. The man who had once been full of energy, who could carry boxes of groceries without breaking a sweat, was now weak and fragile, needing help with the most basic tasks. His hands would tremble uncontrollably as he tried to hold a spoon, and he could barely button his own shirt. Lucia could see it in his eyes, the frustration, the helplessness. Marcos was a proud man. He had built a successful business from the ground up, and now, this cruel disease was stripping away his independence piece by piece. His once strong hands, which had held her so many times in the past, now shook uncontrollably. His legs, once firm and sturdy, now gave way under him with alarming frequency. And worst of all, the love of her life, the man she had promised to stand by no matter what, was slowly becoming a shadow of himself. At first, Lucia did everything she could to help him. She was there for every doctor's appointment, making sure he had his medications on time and helping him with his daily routines. She helped him put on his shoes when his hands wouldn't work, brushed his hair when his body refused to cooperate, and even fed him when he couldn't hold a fork. She knew that his disease would progress over time, but nothing could prepare her for the pain of watching it happen before her eyes. But as the months turned into years, the strain began to wear her down. The love she had once felt for Marcos began to morph into something different. The constant caregiving took a toll on her mental and emotional health. She had always prided herself on being a loving, devoted wife, but now, she found herself resenting the very man she had vowed to protect. Every time she looked at him, she saw a stranger, someone she didn't recognize. The vibrant, confident man she had married was no longer there. Her mind would often wander to a time before Parkinson's had taken over their lives, the carefree days when they would laugh together, travel together, and build their dreams. Those days seemed so far away, like another life altogether. It felt as though the disease was not only taking Marcos, but also her. The woman she used to be, the one full of life, the one with dreams and passions, seemed to disappear with each passing day. Her own identity became entangled with the constant act of caregiving. She had stopped living for herself. Her entire existence revolved around Marcos's illness. The exhaustion from caring for him wore on her, both physically and emotionally. Each day felt like a repetition of the last. She had no time for herself, no time to pursue her own desires. The woman who had once been so vibrant and full of potential now felt trapped in a life she never signed up for. It wasn't that she didn't love Marcos. She did, more than anything. But love, in this case, felt like a weight on her shoulders, pulling her deeper into a life of sacrifice and self-neglect. Her friends would tell her she was doing a noble thing, that she was a saint for taking care of him. But that didn't ease the pain in her heart. She didn't feel like a saint. She felt like a prisoner in her own life. She felt as though the woman she had once been was fading away, like a memory locked behind the iron bars of duty. Then came Victor. Victor was Marcos's business partner, a man who had been by their side for many years. At first, he was just a figure in the background, someone Lucia saw occasionally at business meetings or social gatherings. But as Marcos's illness progressed, Victor started visiting their home more often. Initially, his presence was comforting. He helped Marcos with some of the business dealings that he could no longer manage himself. He would assist with paperwork, run errands, and even sit with Marcos when Lucia needed a break. But as time went on, Lucia started to notice something. Victor wasn't just helping out of the goodness of his heart. He was looking at her differently, with a gaze that lingered just a little too long. His compliments, once casual and friendly, began to feel more like flirtation. He would tell her that she looked beautiful even on the days when she was exhausted from taking care of her husband. He would make little jokes, touch her arm just a bit too much, and whisper things in her ear that made her heart skip a beat. At first, she brushed it off, telling herself that she was imagining things. But deep down, she knew what was happening. Victor, the man who had once been just a business partner, was now showing interest in her, something she hadn't experienced in so long. She felt an odd mixture of guilt and desire. She was married, committed to Marcos, and yet, a part of her longed for the attention that Victor was giving her. The affection, the kind words, the tenderness. It felt like a lifeline in a sea of despair. One evening, after Marcos had gone to bed early, exhausted from the day's physical therapy, Victor stayed behind to help Lucia sort through some paperwork. It was supposed to be a simple task, but the atmosphere between them was thick with unspoken tension. Lucia could feel his presence like a weight in the room, and when he spoke, his voice was lower, more intimate. He asked her how she was holding up, how she was really feeling. "It must be so hard for you," Victor said, his voice full of sympathy. "To watch him fade away like this. You deserve more, Lucia. You deserve to feel loved, to feel alive again." Lucia didn't know how to respond. She had heard those words 1,000 times before, but never from someone like him. She had always been so focused on Marcos's needs, but at that moment, she felt something stir inside her, something she hadn't felt in years. Victor continued, inching closer to her, his voice becoming more seductive. "You're so beautiful, Lucia. You shouldn't have to live like this. You deserve someone who can give you everything." Lucia's heart raced as she felt his hand brush against hers. She felt a heat in her chest, a longing she had pushed down for so long. Victor made her feel seen in a way Marcos no longer could. For the first time in years, she felt desirable, wanted, important. She pulled her hand away, her breath shaky, but the damage was already done. She could feel the weight of temptation pressing down on her. She knew that Victor was dangerous. She knew he was taking advantage of her vulnerability. But she couldn't help it. The loneliness, the guilt, the overwhelming pressure of caring for Marcos had made her weak. She was tired. So very tired. And in that moment, a seed was planted in Lucia's heart, a seed that would soon grow into something she couldn't control. The days following that fateful night were a blur for Lucia. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Victor's face, felt his touch, and heard his whispered words. They echoed in her mind, fueling a deep internal conflict. The guilt gnawed at her like a constant ache, but at the same time, there was something else, a strange sense of longing. She found herself craving the attention he had shown her, the way he had made her feel alive in a world that had become all too monotonous and painful. Victor had slipped under her skin without her even realizing it. He didn't push her. He didn't force anything. He was subtle, his presence always just enough to remind her of the woman she used to be, the woman who had dreams, passions, and desires. He knew how to make her feel important, special, something she hadn't felt in so long. And every time she looked at him, she saw the possibility of a different life, a life where she didn't have to wake up each day and face the slow death of the man she had once adored. Her thoughts began to drift to Victor more frequently, especially when she saw Marcos struggling. The more she watched her husband's condition deteriorate, the more unbearable it became. Every day, his tremors worsened, his speech slurred, and his body became weaker. He could no longer walk without help, and his once confident voice was now barely a whisper. The man she had fallen in love with, the man who had been her equal, was slipping away before her eyes. But the emotional weight of caring for him was taking a toll on Lucia in ways she never expected. She had stopped being a wife and had become a caregiver, a role that was slowly consuming her. Her life had become a routine of doctor's appointments, medication schedules, and endless hours of tending to Marcos's every need. The man who once made her laugh, who had shared so many adventures with her, was now a shadow of his former self. And as his illness progressed, so did her resentment. She tried to suppress it, telling herself that this was her duty, that she had made a vow, but deep down, she couldn't deny the frustration building within her. She had no time for herself, no time to mourn the life she had lost. All her energy was spent on a man who could no longer give her the emotional connection they once shared. What was left of their marriage was a shell of what it had been. And then there was Victor. He would show up unexpectedly, always with that same charm, always knowing the right thing to say. He would drop by to check on Marcos, of course, but the conversations always seemed to shift toward her. He would ask how she was holding up, whether she needed anything. At first, Lucia thought he was just being kind, a good friend trying to help. But over time, it became clear that his intentions were different.
He knew how to play the game.
He would comment on her beauty, on how strong she was, how incredible it was that she could hold everything together while watching the love of her life slip away. He seemed to understand her pain, but it was more than that. He was slowly feeding her hunger for affection, for validation, for attention that she had been starving for. Every word, every glance, every touch was like a thread pulling her deeper into his web. Lucia tried to ignore it, to focus on Marcos, but it was becoming increasingly difficult. Victor's presence in her life was undeniable, and with each passing day, it felt like the only part of her life that had any spark. It wasn't just the attention he gave her, it was the way he made her feel.
Alive.
Desirable. Wanted. Things she hadn't felt in years. One afternoon, as she sat with Marcos, feeding him his lunch and watching him struggle with the simplest of tasks, her mind wandered back to Victor. She couldn't help it. She was so tired of the constant caregiving, of watching her husband deteriorate. The man she had once known and loved seemed to be gone, replaced by someone who needed her in ways she wasn't sure she could give anymore. She felt the weight of her own loneliness, the deep yearning for something, anything, that could break her from the suffocating routine of grief and care. Victor had already made it clear that he was willing to be that escape, that someone who could make her feel seen again. He was offering her the chance to be more than just a caregiver, more than just a wife who had become an emotional caregiver to a man who could no longer reciprocate her love. She had lost herself in her role as the devoted spouse, but Victor was offering her a way out, a way to feel alive again. It was that afternoon that Lucia found herself alone with Victor again, this time under the pretense of discussing business. Marcos had fallen asleep after a particularly grueling session with his therapist, and Victor had come to check on some paperwork for the business. Lucia felt the pull of temptation even before he entered the room. The way he looked at her, the way he made her feel like she mattered, it was intoxicating. They sat across from one another, the silence between them thick with unspoken words. Victor leaned in slightly, his voice softer than usual. "Lucia," he said, his eyes locking onto hers, "I know this is difficult. I can see how hard you're trying to hold everything together. But you don't have to do this alone. You're allowed to live your own life too. You're allowed to be happy again." Lucia's heart pounded in her chest. She knew what he was implying. She knew what he wanted. And part of her wanted it, too. For so long, she had pushed her own needs aside, thinking that it was selfish to want more. She had sacrificed everything for Marcos, her dreams, her independence, and now, even her happiness. And yet, here was Victor, offering her a way out. His voice dropped even lower, his tone becoming more intimate. "I see you, Lucia. I see the woman you used to be. The one who deserved to be loved, to be cherished. You're still that woman. And you don't have to keep pretending that you're okay when you're not. You don't have to keep sacrificing yourself for someone who can't even recognize you anymore." His words were a balm to her soul, but they were also a poison. They made her feel understood in a way that Marcos no longer could. But they also made her feel something else, guilt, shame. She was betraying him, the man she had promised to care for, the man who had once been everything to her. But the truth was, she couldn't shake the feeling that something inside her was breaking, something that had been suffocating for so long. And Victor was offering her an escape, a way to stop drowning in the sea of caregiving and grief that had consumed her life for the past few years. It was then, in that moment of weakness, that Lucia allowed herself to lean into the temptation. She reached across the table, her hand brushing against his, and for the first time in years, she felt a spark of something other than pain and sorrow. "Victor," she whispered, her voice trembling, "I don't know if I can do this anymore." And that was all it took. Victor's response was immediate. He stood up, moving closer to her, his hand gently cupping her face as he looked down at her with soft eyes. "You don't have to do it alone anymore," he murmured, his lips almost brushing hers. "I'll be here for you, Lucia. Always." The moment was electric. Lucia could feel her pulse racing as she realized that the path she was about to take would change everything. She was about to betray her husband, her vows, and everything she had ever stood for. But in that instant, the temptation felt too strong to resist. And so, she allowed herself to fall, knowing that once she did, there would be no going back. The days following that moment of weakness between Lucia and Victor were a whirlwind. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt his presence, his gaze, his touch, the way he made her feel seen in ways that Marcos no longer could. Victor's visits became more frequent, his attention more intense. Lucia couldn't deny that a part of her was grateful for it. She had spent years caring for Marcos, watching him fade away with each passing day, and here was Victor, offering her something she hadn't felt in so long: affection, desire, and the possibility of a life beyond the pain. But even as she basked in the warmth of Victor's attention, a quiet voice in the back of her mind warned her. She had been down this road before, and she knew that the allure of escape could easily lead to ruin. She was still married, still bound by vows that she had promised to honor. Yet, the reality of caring for a husband who was slowly slipping away was becoming more difficult with each passing day. Marcos's tremors were worse, his speech more slurred, and his body more fragile. The man she had once loved was vanishing, leaving behind a shell of himself that was difficult to care for, much less love in the way she had once. Lucia's conflict deepened. She would look at Marcos, lying in bed, helpless, and the anger inside her would flare. The resentment she had tried to suppress bubbled to the surface. It wasn't that she didn't love him. She did, but love was no longer enough to sustain her. She had given everything for him, sacrificed her own dreams and desires, and now she was left exhausted and empty. It felt like she was mourning a man who was already gone, while he was still physically there. Victor's influence was growing stronger, his presence increasingly difficult to resist. He knew how to push the right buttons, how to make her feel wanted, desired, alive. His words, soft, seductive, full of promises, were like a balm to her wounded soul. Every compliment, every lingering glance, chipped away at the walls she had built around herself. And for a while it felt good. It felt like a reprieve from the constant weight of caregiving, from the unrelenting sorrow that consumed her every waking moment. But then came the day that Lucia couldn't ignore the truth any longer. It was a simple moment, really. Victor was at the house helping with some business matters. Marcos had fallen asleep after a long therapy session, his body completely drained. Lucia had taken a break to sip tea in the kitchen, and as she did, her eyes landed on a folder of papers Victor had left out on the counter. Without thinking, she reached for it, flipping through the pages absent-mindedly. And there it was, a document with Marcos's name on it, detailing his estate, his company, and his assets. Her heart sank as she scanned the numbers, the potential, the future. She knew that Victor had been asking an increasing number of questions about Marcos's health and the state of the business. At first, she had dismissed it as concern, but now, she wasn't so sure. The document was all too clear. Victor wasn't just helping with the business out of kindness. He had been positioning himself for something more. A rush of realization hit her. Victor wasn't in love with her. He had never been. He was after Marcos's wealth, after the control of the company that Marcos had built with years of hard work. She had been so wrapped up in her own needs, her own loneliness, that she had missed the subtle manipulation. The way he'd subtly steered conversations toward finances, The way he'd promised to help her with the business decisions once Marcos was no longer able to manage them. This had all been part of his plan. Lucia felt a cold shiver run through her as she put the papers back in place, her mind racing. She had allowed herself to be used. She had let Victor play on her vulnerabilities to make her feel special, while all along, he had been using her to secure his own future. The guilt, the shame, hit her like a tidal wave, but beneath it all, something else stirred. Anger. Betrayal. She had always been careful with the financial side of Marcos's life, but this letter hinted at something more. Something more urgent. Lucia couldn't shake the sense that something was about to change, something beyond just the management of his estate. Her heart raced, and her mind started to spiral.
Could Victor have known about this?
Had he been waiting for this moment all along? The letter felt like an invitation into a future she wasn't ready to face, one that might demand more of her than she could give. The idea of handling everything alone, of making decisions without the support of a partner, terrified her. She had always deferred to Marcos when it came to the business. But now, his deteriorating condition meant that all responsibility had fallen squarely on her shoulders. She had been managing the business on autopilot, ensuring everything ran smoothly, but now, with the law firm's invitation looming, it felt as though the entire foundation of her life was starting to crack. Victor's words from their last conversation echoed in her mind. He had promised her that he could help. He had promised that he would be there, guiding her through the complexities of running the business. The more she thought about it, the more his promise seemed like a carefully crafted pitch, one designed to make her feel vulnerable enough to let him in. And yet, there was part of her, something deep inside, that still wanted to believe in him. Maybe he wasn't completely motivated by greed. Maybe he truly cared for her, as he had claimed. The line between truth and manipulation was becoming so thin that Lucia wasn't sure where one ended and the other began. She decided to go to the meeting alone. She couldn't rely on Victor, not anymore. And, despite her fears, she knew that she had to take control of this part of her life. The thought of stepping into the world of business without Marcos beside her filled her with dread, but she knew there was no turning back now. The day of the meeting arrived, and Lucia put on a brave face. She wore the dress she had once felt confident in, the one that used to make her feel powerful and in control. But as she walked into the sleek, sterile conference room, she felt small. The polished wood of the table, the serious expressions of the lawyers, the weight of the documents in front of her, all of it reminded her how out of place she felt in this world. This was Marcos's world, not hers. But today, it would be hers to navigate. The meeting began with formalities. Introductions, small talk about Marcos's condition, the expected updates about the company. The lawyers spoke in calm, measured tones, their words precise and professional. But Lucia's mind was far away, drifting through memories of a time when she had been a part of this world, when she had been more than just the woman who cared for Marcos. At one point, one of the lawyers, Mr. Thompson, shifted the conversation. "Mrs. Diaz," he began, "we've been reviewing the company's financial standing and the plans for the future. Given your husband's condition, it's important that we discuss the direction of the business and ensure a smooth transition." Lucia's heart sank. The future. The inevitable passing of Marcos, both physically and in terms of his role in the company, was something she had been avoiding for so long. But now, she had no choice but to face it. She nodded, forcing herself to listen, even as the weight of the words threatened to overwhelm her. "Your husband's estate, as you know, is significant," Mr. Thompson continued. "There are some important decisions that need to be made regarding the future of the business, the distribution of assets, and potential partnerships. We've considered all options, and we believe it may be time to consider restructuring the company to safeguard its future." Her mind raced. Restructuring. It was the inevitable step, but it felt like a slap in the face. Was this the beginning of the end? Would she be forced to decide whether to sell everything Marcos had built? To move on? To close this chapter of their lives forever? As the meeting stretched on, Lucia felt herself slipping deeper into a fog of confusion. She had come here to take control, but instead, she felt powerless, as though the future was being decided without her. The life she had known, the life that had revolved around caring for Marcos, was slipping away, piece by piece. And yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of a much larger change, one that would force her to confront her past, her choices, and the future she had always avoided. The meeting had left Lucia feeling disoriented and overwhelmed, a knot of dread settling heavily in her chest. The lawyers had continued discussing details she wasn't ready to confront. The phrase, business restructuring, echoed in her mind, gnawing at her like a relentless tide. Marcos's legacy, his empire, was hanging in the balance. But somehow, it felt less like his world and more like an alien landscape, one that she didn't belong to. The weight of the decisions before her seemed unbearable. After the meeting, Lucia returned to the house and stood in the doorway, staring at the living room. The home, which once felt like a sanctuary, now seemed like a museum of memories, its walls heavy with the ghosts of a life she had once known. She had always been the caretaker, the one who ensured everything ran smoothly. But now, standing in the midst of it all, she felt like a stranger in her own life. She had always believed that her love for Marcos would guide her through any difficulty. But now, love felt like a double-edged sword. It was what had kept her here all these years, but it was also the reason she was tethered to a life that was slipping through her fingers. The love she had for Marcos, once vibrant and life-affirming, was now weighed down by guilt, frustration, and an overwhelming sense of responsibility. Lucia's thoughts returned to Victor. His face, his words, the way he had looked at her during their last conversation, it all lingered in her mind like a shadow. She hadn't seen him since their confrontation, but she couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching her from the periphery, waiting for her to make a decision. Perhaps he was right. Perhaps it was time for her to step out of the shadows and reclaim the parts of herself that had been buried for so long. But even as that thought took root, a lingering unease twisted in her stomach. Victor was a man who understood the mechanics of manipulation like no one else. He had always been skilled at playing on emotions, coaxing people into doing what he wanted, without them realizing it. He never asked directly. Instead, he made them believe it was their idea, their choice. And when they faltered, he was always there to pull them back into his orbit. She couldn't help but wonder if that's what he was doing now, waiting, silently coaxing her, perhaps believing she would eventually crumble under the weight of the choices he made for her. After all, it was never about her needs, her desires. It was always about what he wanted. That was the truth she had buried deep inside her heart. The next few days passed in a blur, the chaos of managing the business and caring for Marcos overwhelming her every waking moment. But still, she couldn't push Victor from her mind. The thoughts of him crept in during the quiet moments, like a dark, insistent whisper in the back of her mind. His words from their last meeting continued to play like a broken record. "You don't have to stay trapped here forever." He made it sound like salvation, but in reality, it was a dangerous path. Victor didn't care about her well-being. He cared about himself, about winning, about getting what he had always wanted: power, control, and the chance to rewrite the past. She had once believed there was a flicker of genuine affection for her in his eyes, but now, all she could see was ambition. His charm was only the surface of a much deeper darkness. He was a predator, and she had been too blinded by her own loneliness to see it. On a particularly quiet evening, when she was alone in the garden, Lucia felt a familiar presence. She looked up and saw him standing at the gate. Victor. Of course. It had been only a matter of time before he returned, seeking to unsettle her once again. "Lucia," he called out softly, his voice carrying across the evening air. "We need to talk." She didn't reply immediately. Her heart rate quickened as she fought the overwhelming urge to ignore him, to turn away and protect herself from whatever he had come to offer, or demand this time. But she couldn't ignore him forever. He had a way of making people feel as if their entire existence hinged on his approval, and she hated that she had ever fallen for it. Reluctantly, she stepped toward him, feeling the weight of his gaze as he studied her, a subtle smirk playing on his lips. "I don't know what you want from me," Lucia said, her voice tight, controlled. I told you before, I can't just walk away. Victor's eyes flickered with something unreadable, perhaps amusement, perhaps frustration. You think I want you to walk away? I want you to live, Lucia. You're suffocating in that life. All these obligations, all these duties, it's all consuming you. Marcos is gone, and yet you're still chained to his memory. You're letting him pull you under. Lucia stiffened at his words. The sting was sharp, but she knew better than to let him see her vulnerability. You don't know anything about my life, Victor, she said, her voice cold. You don't get to tell me what I should or shouldn't do. Victor's gaze didn't waver. I know enough to see what's really going on. You're lost, Lucia. You're trapped in a world that no longer exists, held hostage by guilt and obligation. And you're too proud to admit that you've been given an opportunity to be free. I gave you that opportunity, but you won't take it. The words sliced through her. She had been working tirelessly to maintain control over her life, but in some corner of her mind, she knew he was right. The person she had been before Marcos's illness had been swallowed whole by the weight of the years, and she had never allowed herself to look back. But something inside her shifted. I'm not like you, Victor, she said slowly, her voice firm. I don't use people for my own gain. For the first time, Victor's expression faltered, just slightly. It was enough to let her see the predator underneath the polished exterior. He wanted her to believe she had no choice, that walking away was a betrayal of everything she had known, of everything they had shared. But he was wrong. She wasn't as weak as he thought. Victor took a step closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. You think you're strong, Lucia, but you're only pretending. If you don't make a decision now, it will be too late. You'll end up just like the rest of them, those people who never dared to break free, who never had the courage to choose what they really wanted. His words were carefully crafted to provoke, to make her feel like a failure if she didn't choose his path. But Lucia knew better now. She had seen enough of his manipulation, his ability to twist truth and sentiment to fit his narrative. I've made my decision, Victor, she said, the words flowing with newfound strength. I'm not your pawn, and I won't play by your rules. For a long moment, Victor said nothing, his eyes narrowing slightly, as though assessing whether she was truly serious or just bluffing. Finally, he stepped back, a small smile creeping across his face. I'll leave you to it, Lucia. But remember this, you'll always wonder what could have been. And when you're drowning in your regrets, don't say I didn't warn you. As he turned and walked away, Lucia felt a strange sense of relief. She had faced him, confronted the darkness he represented, and emerged stronger. She wasn't free yet, but she was no longer trapped by his false promises. Victor was right about one thing, though. The road ahead would be difficult, but it would be hers to navigate, not his. And for the first time in a long time, Lucia could see the faintest glimmer of hope, like a distant star guiding her through the shadows. Lucia's decision to stand firm against Victor felt like a small but crucial victory. For the first time in months, the weight of uncertainty began to lift, and her steps, though hesitant, felt steadier. Yet, even as she tried to take control, the world around her seemed to keep shifting. She could no longer ignore the reality of the life she had been forced to carry on her shoulders, her husband's legacy, the family business, and the people who depended on her. These were responsibilities she had inherited with love, but now they felt like shackles, holding her in place while the world beyond moved on. The next few days passed in a haze. Lucia spent most of her time at the office, poring over financial reports and board meeting minutes. The business was teetering on the edge of crisis, and the pressures were mounting with every passing day. She had hired a team of experts to help steer the company through the storm, but no matter how much work she did, it never seemed to be enough. There was always something else that needed fixing, another fire to put out. Her entire existence had become a never-ending series of urgent tasks, each one more consuming than the last. She felt it in her bones. The exhaustion was beginning to erode her resolve. One evening, as she sat in her office long after everyone had gone home, the phone rang. Her heart skipped a beat when she saw the name on the caller ID, Victor. Her instincts told her to ignore it, but a part of her, a small, vulnerable part, still wondered what he wanted. She picked up the phone, her voice betraying a mixture of weariness and wariness. "Lucia," he said, his voice smooth and unbothered by the passage of time. "I know you've been busy. I've been following the news about the company. I wanted to check in, see how you're doing." Lucia bit her lip, trying to suppress the anger bubbling up within her. "I'm fine, Victor. I don't need your help." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line, and then he chuckled, the sound sending a shiver down her spine. "You're always so determined to do everything on your own. I admire that about you. But let me be clear, Lucia. You can't do this alone. The company is in deeper trouble than you realize, and you're running out of time." Lucia's fingers tightened around the receiver. She knew he was trying to manipulate her, to make her believe that the weight of the world was crashing down on her. But this time, she wasn't going to fall for it. "I don't need you to tell me what I already know," she said coldly. "I have everything under control." There was a moment of tension on the line before Victor's voice softened, as though trying to coax her into agreement. "Lucia, I'm not here to make you feel weak. I'm here because I know you need someone to help you navigate the next steps. The company is a delicate thing, and without the right people in place, it could all fall apart. You need someone who understands how things work." "I'm not interested in your offer," she said, her words firm. "I'm going to fix this on my own." Victor didn't respond immediately. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. Finally, he spoke again, his tone darker now, more insistent. "I don't think you understand what you're up against. There are people who want to take the company from you. People who don't care about your struggle. You're walking a dangerous line, Lucia. You need to act before it's too late." Her pulse quickened. She had known there were always those who were eager to take advantage of her vulnerability, to seize the business from her. But hearing Victor say it so bluntly made the threat feel far more real. It was a reminder of the harsh reality she was living in. People like Victor were never satisfied with just winning. They wanted to see their rivals fall. "I don't need your threats, Victor," she said, her voice trembling only slightly. "I've made my decision, and I'm not going to let you or anyone else dictate my choices." For a long moment, there was no sound on the other end. Then Victor's voice returned, colder than before. "You'll regret this, Lucia. I promise you. You'll wish you had listened to me." He hung up before she could respond, leaving her to stew in the sudden emptiness that filled the space around her. The anger that had flared up in her chest started to dissipate, leaving behind a gnawing sense of uncertainty. Was Victor right? Had she made the wrong decision by rejecting his offer of help? She pushed the thought aside. No, she couldn't afford to second-guess herself now. She had made her choice, and she had to live with it. But even as she tried to focus on the work ahead, Lucia couldn't shake the feeling that someone, was waiting for her to falter. Victor's words lingered in her mind, like a shadow she couldn't escape. The following morning, as Lucia arrived at the office early, she was met by her assistant, Maria, who looked unusually flustered. "There's someone here to see you," Maria said, a nervous edge to her voice. "It's urgent." Lucia frowned.
Who is it?
It's Victor," Maria said, almost apologetically. Lucia's stomach twisted. She had hoped she wouldn't have to see him again so soon. "Send him in," she said, her voice hardening. She wasn't going to be intimidated. Not now, not after everything she had fought for. Victor entered a few moments later, his calm demeanor almost infuriating. His dark suit was perfectly tailored, his posture immaculate. He exuded the kind of confidence that made him seem untouchable. The moment he stepped into the room, Lucia's pulse quickened. "Lucia," he said, his voice smooth and reassuring. "I wanted to talk to you in person. I'm not here to fight with you, but to offer you a solution. There's still time to make things right." Lucia held his gaze, refusing to show any weakness. "I've made my decision, Victor. I don't need your help." He smiled, a sly, knowing smile. "That's what you think, but I'm afraid you're not seeing the bigger picture. People are circling, Lucia. The vultures are waiting for you to make a mistake. You can't keep everything together on your own. You don't have the resources to fight them off." Lucia's heart raced as his words cut through her. The truth was, She didn't know if she could protect the company alone. She didn't know if she could keep it all from falling apart. And Victor knew it. "I don't want your help," she repeated, though her voice trembled just slightly. "I can do this." Victor took a step closer to her, his presence overwhelming. "You may be able to try," he said softly, "but I know you. You're not the kind of person who can fail without it destroying you. And when everything falls apart, I'll be the one you'll turn to. Don't make me wait too long, Lucia." Lucia felt the tension building, the pressure threatening to overwhelm her. But in that moment, something in her snapped. She had already made her decision. She wouldn't let him control her anymore. "Leave," she said, her voice stronger now, firmer than she had ever been with him before. "You don't scare me, Victor. And I don't need you." For a long moment, Victor didn't move. His gaze lingered on her, as if he were searching for a crack, a sign that she might reconsider. But Lucia held his stare, refusing to look away. Finally, Victor gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Very well," he said, his voice colder than before. "But don't say I didn't warn you." As he turned and walked out of the room, Lucia exhaled, the tension that had been suffocating her slowly ebbing away. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but for the first time in a long while, she felt like she was on the path to something that was truly her own. She wasn't done yet, and she wasn't going to let Victor or anyone else take that from her. Lucia stood at the edge of her office, her gaze fixed on the sprawling city below. The weight of the past few months was suffocating, but she had always been someone who thrived under pressure. She had proven herself time and time again, first as her father's daughter, then as his heir, and now as the woman who would turn this company around. She could feel it in the air, the last remnants of doubt lingering, trying to creep into her mind. But she wasn't the same person who had walked into that first board meeting, unsure and hesitant. She had learned how to fight, how to push past fear, how to make decisions that would shape the future. And as much as Victor thought he could break her down, she would prove him wrong. She wasn't going to crumble under his expectations. She was going to exceed them. Victor had made his move. He had tried to control her, to manipulate her with his sharp words and dangerous charm. But Lucia knew something he didn't. She wasn't a woman to be controlled. Not anymore. She wasn't interested in playing his games. She had something far more powerful at her disposal. She had herself. The first few days after their last encounter were intense. Lucia buried herself in work, pushing through the relentless stream of meetings, reports, and calls. But instead of feeling overwhelmed, she felt alive. She could sense her own growth, the transformation happening beneath the surface. Every challenge became a test of her strength. Every decision she made was sharper, more confident. She wasn't just managing the company, she was taking charge of her own destiny. Her team began to notice the change too. At first, they had seen her as the boss's wife, the one who had inherited the business, but lacked the real grit to carry it.
But now
They saw her as someone to respect, someone who could lead them through the storm. They saw the fire in her eyes, the unwavering resolve in her every word. One day, as Lucia stood before a room full of key investors, preparing to pitch a new proposal that could potentially save the company from disaster, she felt a surge of clarity. This wasn't just about numbers or deals, it was about demonstrating who she had become. She was no longer the uncertain woman who had walked into Victor's world. She was the woman who had learned the most important lesson of all: how to captivate, how to influence, how to command attention without needing to ask for it. "Thank you all for being here," Lucia began, her voice steady, each word cutting through the tension in the room. "This company stands at a crossroads, and what we choose today will determine our future. But this isn't just about survival. This is about thriving, about seizing the opportunity that lies ahead. And the future I see is one we can shape together." Her words weren't just about business. They were about vision, about possibility. The room hung on every syllable, not because of what she was offering them, but because of who she had become. The investors listened, rapt, almost as though they were seeing her for the first time. By the time the meeting concluded, Lucia had secured the backing she needed. The proposal was accepted, and with it came the relief she so desperately craved. But what she didn't expect was the sense of power that flooded her, the realization that she had done it on her own, without needing to lean on anyone for advice or support. That night, as she sat in her office, her heart racing with the exhilaration of her success, she thought of her husband, Marcos. The man she had married years ago had always been her rock. He had been there for her in ways no one else had, standing by her side through the most challenging times. And now, despite his illness, Parkinson's disease that was slowly taking away his strength, he was still the man who made her smile every day, the one who reminded her why she fought so hard. Marcos had always been strong, even before the diagnosis. But now, as his movements became more sluggish, as his once vibrant spirit began to wane with the progression of his condition, Lucia found herself not only managing a company, but caring for the man she loved in ways she never thought she would. But through it all, she refused to allow herself to succumb to the helplessness that could so easily engulf her. She refused to give in to the temptation to feel weak, to feel like everything was slipping away. If anything, Marcos's illness gave her more determination to prove herself, not just for the business, but for him. When she came home that night, she found Marcos sitting in his favorite chair by the window. He looked up as she entered, and even in his weakened state, his eyes still held that spark, the spark that had first drawn her to him. He smiled, a slow, tender smile that always seemed to say more than words could. "How was the meeting?" he asked, his voice faint, but still warm with love. "Better than I expected," Lucia replied, a grin tugging at her lips. She knelt beside him, gently brushing a lock of hair from his forehead. "We've secured the funding we needed. It's a game changer." "I knew you could do it," he said softly. "You've always been stronger than you give yourself credit for." Her heart swelled. There was something deeply powerful about Marcos's unwavering belief in her, especially as he faced the challenge of his illness every day. His faith in her was not just about the company, it was about the woman she had become, the woman who could face impossible odds and still rise to the occasion. Lucia pressed her hand against his cheek, feeling the warmth of his skin, the slight tremor that always seemed to be there now. "I couldn't have done it without you," she whispered. "Your strength, your love, it's been my anchor. You make me want to be better." She looked at him, a deep sense of gratitude filling her. Despite everything, the battles at work, the challenges with Victor, and the constant reminder of the fragility of life, Lucia knew she could handle whatever came next. She had the strength to overcome, to thrive, to build not just a legacy for herself, but for the man who had always believed in her, even when she hadn't believed in herself. As the days passed, Lucia's confidence continued to grow. She wasn't just succeeding in business, she was becoming a force to be reckoned with. Her team followed her lead, the investors trusted her vision, and the employees respected her. But there was something more that Lucia hadn't anticipated. She was attracting attention, not just from her colleagues or clients, but from everyone around her. People were drawn to her energy, her presence, her undeniable confidence. She had unlocked a part of herself that she hadn't even known existed, and it was impossible to ignore. But it wasn't just about business success. Lucia felt the change in her personal life, too. Men who had once overlooked her now watched her with interest, admiration, even awe. It wasn't just the way she carried herself, it was the energy she exuded, the confidence, the magnetism. Lucia realized that this newfound power wasn't limited to the boardroom. It was a part of who she was, in every aspect of her life. And it made her irresistible. As she sat at dinner with a group of business partners one evening, she felt someone's gaze on her. Turning, she locked eyes with a man across the table. There was a spark there, an intensity in his stare that sent a shiver down her spine. For a moment, she let herself enjoy the attention, reveling in the knowledge that she could captivate him with nothing more than a glance. He wasn't the first, and he wouldn't be the last. And that's when it hit her. She wasn't just running a company anymore. She was commanding the attention of everyone around her. She had become the woman who could have anyone, the one who held the power to make men crave her without saying a word. If you've ever felt like you're invisible to the man you desire, or like no matter how hard you try, they always seem to slip away. There's a secret to breaking through those barriers. There's a way to tap into that irresistible magnetism, the same secret that Lucia discovered on her journey to becoming unstoppable. It's not about playing games or pretending to be someone else. It's about understanding how to make a man obsess over you, how to unlock the power that lies within you and make it work for you. The good news is you don't have to wait. You can learn this secret too, and it only takes a few simple steps. Ready to discover what makes men fall head over heels? Click the link in the description or point your camera at the QR code on the screen. Don't wait. This is the secret to unlocking your power, just like Lucia did.